without a word of a lie, this is true. We didn't stop to think that the total distance was about 8,000 miles. See, we were big picture people. We didn't let ourselves get bogged down with details. We were young and we hadn't learned that it's the details that get you every single time. So we took a train down to London, and there we bought bicycles. See, we'd never heard of anyone riding from London to Johannesburg on bicycles, so we decided that we would do it first and become famous. That was another mistake. We soon learned that when you ride bicycles across France in the springtime, you find that the hills are all uphill and the wind is always in your face. So likewise, I found that when you embark on any new venture, you often find the same thing. Everything seems to go wrong, usually at the worst possible time and in the worst possible and most expensive way, like starting a new business or a new career. Anyway, after 2 weeks of grinding along on bicycles, uphill the whole way, which seems like a geographical impossibility, but it's true, we said, the heck with this. We loaded the bikes on a train and we rode across France and Spain to Gibraltar. There we sold the bicycles and bought a Land Rover with our last dollar. We had definitely learned why no one had ever crossed Africa on bicycles. It was darn near impossible to cross France on bicycles. Europe on bicycles. Anyway, so now we had a little problem. We were out of money. We'd exhausted our meager finances buying the Land Rover, and we didn't have enough money for fuel and equipment. So we all sat down. We considered ourselves great writers at that time. We all sat down and wrote letters to everybody that we knew, pleading for money, telling them how desperate our situation was. Sitting here looking across the Straits of Gibraltar to Africa. All we needed was just a little bit of money to get us over there. Anyway, eventually we got a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there, and then we got one big score. I'll never forget this. An uncle of Jeff's that he'd only seen once in his life sent us 100 pounds. 100 pounds at that time was $300, worth more than $1,000 today. And we were ecstatic. We were saved. So this was another lesson. Nobody ever makes it on their own. One of the great lessons of life. We all need help from others to get over the rough spots on the journey of life. Well, with the additional money, we loaded up with food and supplies. We took the ferry over to Tangiers in Morocco, and then we headed out of Tangiers toward the Atlas Mountains and the Sahara, full of excitement, singing as we drove down the road. 20 miles out, the radiator blew up. The Land Rover had never been driven on the open road. It had spent its whole working life tooling around the narrow streets of Gibraltar, and once on the open road, it began to fall apart. The radiator was just the beginning. Over the next 10 days, the steering rods bent and threw the front wheels out of alignment, so the tires blew one by one. We had trouble with the carburetor and the ignition system. We were so poorly equipped, if you can believe it, we didn't even have a jack or a lug wrench. When we got a flat tire, and we got lots of flat tires, we had to sit by the side of the road patiently, sometimes for hours, until somebody came along with the proper tools to help us change the tire. But we pressed on anyway. As we drove deeper into Morocco and over the Atlas Mountains and onto the Sahara Escarpment, we entered into a world that had changed very little in 1,000 years. There were long, long stretches of barren country roads and an occasional oasis surrounded by primitive farms, which was irrigated from wells and underground rivers. And that began an experience that I still remember quite clearly, and I think you'll be able to relate to this. By this time, I was speaking French fairly well. We could converse with the natives in the occasional small towns that we passed through. And in one town, early in our slow, halting trek across Morocco, someone asked us where we were headed. And we told them that we were going across the Sahara and into Africa. And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "You can't do that." He said, "You'll die in the desert." Well, I looked up my dictionary quickly because I didn't understand the expression. Vous allez mourir dans le buste. Vous allez mourir dans le buste. Okay? Vous allez, you will die in the desert. We then began to hear this on a regular basis everywhere we went. We'd stop in a small town, and people would bring their friends up to us and introduce us as the young men who were going off to die in the desert. Well, they seemed quite cheerful about it, but after a while, we found it kind of irritating. I mean, and by the way, these were not your average Arabs. These were Bedouin and Tuareg. These were desert people, members of tribes that lived in the Sahara for 1,000 years. I mean, they were in a position to know what they were talking about. And I learned a valuable lesson from this. I learned then, and for the rest of your life, whenever you try to do something out of the ordinary, people will line up to tell you that you can't do it, why you can't do it, that you'll lose your time, you'll lose your money, that you will, in effect, die in the desert. Even people who should know better will try to discourage you. To achieve anything greater worthwhile, you must train yourself to rise above these people, ignoring them and pressing on towards your goal regardless. Geez, you're great guys. I love it. We crossed from Morocco into Algeria and drove south to the town of Adrar on the edge of the Sahara. By this time, our vehicle was falling apart. And with the cost of repairs and gasoline and food, we'd almost run out of money again. One of the guys, sick from dysentery, decided to give up. He took his money and his belongings and he hitchhiked to the Mediterranean, 500 miles north and then back to England. That left two of us. We began wondering, what are we doing here? We were two young men, 20 and 21 years of age, thousands of miles from home, sick, tired, and almost broke, with thousands of miles ahead of us. We couldn't even remember why we started out in the first place, except that we had set it as a goal. And we were too dumb to change it. Anyway, but one of the things that kept us going was a book of poetry by Robert W. Service. Robert W. Service had driven an ambulance in World War I, and he'd written poetry to cheer up the soldiers in the trenches on the Western Front. And there was one poem that we read over and over. It always gave us a boost in the determination to go forward, and it was called Carry On. And it started like this. It said, "It's easy to fight when everything's right, when you're mad with the thrill and the glory. It's easy to cheer when victory is near and wallow in fields that are gory. It's a different song when everything's wrong, when you're feeling infernally mortal, when it's 10 against 1 and hope there is none. Buck up, little soldier, and chortle. Carry on, there isn't much punch in your blow. You're glaring and staring and hitting out blinds. You're muddy and bloody, but never you mind. Carry on. You haven't the ghost of a show. It's looking like death, but while you've a breath, carry on, my son, carry on." Well, by this time we were in the Sahara, the largest desert on Earth. It stretches across the Tropic of Capricorn from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, more than 5,000 miles. And the part that we faced, dead ahead, was the Tenerife, the emptiest single stretch of the Sahara. 500 miles of nothing, not a fly, not a blade of grass, as flat as a tabletop. 500 miles. The enormity of what we had embarked on finally began to sink in. We learned that more than 1,300 people had perished in the Tenerife in the last 20 years. 42 vehicles had broken down in the desert, and many of their drivers were never seen again alive. By this time, Jeff and I were once more out of money. All our tires were scraped bald and they needed to be replaced. We needed additional tanks so we could carry enough gas and water for the crossing. We needed tools to do repairs. We needed a jack and lug wrench so that we could change tires. Obvious. For 3 weeks we stayed in a drawer. Jeff hitchhiked north to Algiers to wire for more money, more creative writing, while I sold all our supplies except for a bare minimum. With that money and by stripping abandoned vehicles, I got the Land Rover repaired and properly outfitted with reasonably good tires, a reserve gas tank, proper tools, and supplies for the crossing. It's amazing how enterprising you become when your survival is at stake. By the way, this story took place 24 years ago today. Imagine. The Sahara Desert in June is hot. How hot is it? It's very hot. It's damn hot. At midday, it reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit. An exposed man can die of dehydration in less than 20 minutes. When the French ran Algeria, they required travelers to carry 5 gallons of water per person per day for the crossing. That's how much you drank. Because of the heat, you can only travel before 10 a.m. and after 4 p.m. The midday sun is so hot that if you drive, your engine oil boils. It becomes as thin as water, and your vehicle seizes up and it'll never run again. 6 weeks after crossing from Gibraltar, we were ready. Jeff came back with some money from his parents, and the vehicle was in perfect condition for the crossing. We realized that if anything did go wrong and we couldn't fix it, we would most certainly die in the desert. 3 days before the big push, the actual crossing, we met 5 Germans in a Volkswagen bus who were waiting for a truck convoy that would cross in a few days. They were going to play it safe and cross with the convoy, safety in numbers. We told them we were going convoy or no convoy, and they decided to cross with us. The Algerian government stamps your passport out of Algeria 500 miles north of the border. From there on, you're on your own, and they couldn't care less what happens to you. As far as they're concerned, you don't exist anymore. So we set out, and I remember this clearly, we set out at sunset on a Thursday following La Piste, which is a French word for track, a very accurate word, track, that led straight south across the desert. We drove through the night. As we drove through the night, about 50 miles out, our troubles began. The Germans' vehicle sunk in and started to get bogged down in the fine sand that had blown over the track. And it also began to break down mechanically. It started getting sand in the carburetor and everything, and it began to delay us hour by hour. We had to get across the 500 miles in 2 days, or we'd be out of water. So we pressed on as fast as we could. But over and over, the German vehicle got stuck, and we had to stop and drag it out with our four-wheel drive Land Rover, losing time and using precious fuel. Jeff and I took turns driving the Land Rover while the German vehicle drove parallel with us across the flat wasteland. And we kept ourselves motivated by quoting the poem, Carry On, back and forth to each other. And the next verse goes like this. And so in the strife of the battle of life, it's easy to fight when you're winning. It's easy to slave and starve and be brave when the dawn of success is beginning. But the man who can meet despair and defeat with a cheer, there's the man of God's choosing. The man who can fight to heaven's own height is the man who can fight when he's losing. Carry on, things never were looming so black, but show that you haven't a cowardly streak, and though you're unlucky, you never are weak. Carry on, brace up for another attack. It's looking like hell, but you never can tell. Carry on, old man, carry on.